Hello there. I thought I'd give you a little overview of how I set up my Taranis to use in this case with the Spitfire, but most of my models are the same. The configuration file for this model is available on rcsettings.com. I will provide the link in the description on this video, so you can download it and use it as a base for your own model if you like what you see. First of all, first thing I did was configure a throttle hold switch so that the throttle is deactivated. It's going to send -100 regardless of the position if the switch is like this. In order to be able to fly, I have to arm the motor and then my throttle becomes active. You can also see that here. Now I have throttle. Engine off. Now I don't. The reason why this is very useful is because I fly with a neck strap, and it's very easy to accidentally bump the throttle. And let me show you what happens when you accidentally bump the throttle. So, then I have these two switches will control the flaps and the landing gear. The landing gear is on this switch, and it's a 3-position switch. If you move it up, it will raise the gear. If you lower it, it will lower the gear, which kind of makes sense. And the center position is going to send the 0 value. That's very useful because it's not going to change the gear position. I found with my previous radio, for some reason, it wouldn't raise or lower the gear when I connected the battery, regardless of the switch position, unless I changed the switch. I found on the Taranis, if you have it set to gear up and your gear is actually down, the moment you connect the battery is going to raise your gear, so that may be a little bit unexpected. So having it in the center position, you're always sure that it's not going to change before, unless you move the switch. On the flaps, I also did something else. Not only does this lower your flaps in 2 positions, it also changes flight modes. And the reason why that is useful is because in flight modes you can have independent trim settings per flight mode. Many planes, as you lower the flaps, you may want to compensate the elevator trim, and having 3 different flight modes means 3 independent elevator trim positions. I've only done it for the elevator. There's no point in changing rudder or aileron trims when you deploy flaps. It's only for elevator that's useful. And it also shows you therefore on the screen because it's a different flight mode. On this rotary button or switch or control, whatever you want to call it, potentiometer, I simply configured audio volume. Now you may notice that for each of my switches I have audio feedback. I think that's extremely useful, especially with a new radio and new model or new configuration of your model. You may not be 100% sure which switch does what. I know oftentimes I'm not 100% certain, so having the Taranis speak out what it does, I think, is extremely useful. But when you're outside, you want this to be as loud as possible because there may be other planes, there may be wind. When you're inside, it may be annoying if it's too loud. So I just configured this as a volume switch. So
0 volts, 3 minutes, 56 seconds.
Just because I wasn't using it for anything else, I thought that's a little useful gimmick. On this switch, on SC, I've put the dual rates and expo settings in 3 steps.
Low rates.
Well, you probably know what that's for. Let me show you anyway. Full deflection on low rates is only going to deflect a little bit.
Medium rates. High rates.
And depending on the rates, I'm going to get more or less deflection. It's also changing the expo settings. You can see that in the configuration file. You probably want to adjust that for your plane and your flying style. On this switch here, I configured a rudder mix. So by default, when I apply aileron, the rudder is not going to move. If I move it down 1 position, it's going to mix in a little bit of rudder for coordinated turns.
Rudder mix enabled.
And the next setting is a little bit more. This switch I'm using to enable or disable logging of telemetry data and radio data. If you pull the switch, it's going to log all the data on the internal SD card, but only if your throttle lock is disengaged, because right now I don't want to be recording stuff like this. It's just going to fill up the radio, the SD card with nonsense data. So only when you're flying, so you have to enable the logging and you have to enable your motor, and then it will start logging everything. Speaking of telemetry, I have the setup with telemetry, but I don't have the plane here to demonstrate to you, unfortunately. But I've configured the trainer switch to momentarily speak out battery voltage.
0 volts, 3 minutes, 56 seconds.
It's saying two things. First of all, it's saying a voltage, and that is what is called in the Taranis the cell value, singular, not cells. Cell value is the lowest voltage of any of your LiPo cells. I think that's the most important value for two reasons. First of all, if your LiPo is out of balance, you really want to know the state of the lowest cell and not necessarily of the entire pack. And secondly, it's also much easier to process mentally, because if you speak out the battery voltage, you have to think, is this a 3 cell, is this a 4 cell, is this a 5 cell, and then you have to start dividing the spoken voltage by that number to get an idea of your battery state. That's way too complicated for me in flight. So just having the single lowest cell value, if it says 3.2 volts, I know I have to land immediately. That's much easier than having said 12.4 volts and I have to start calculating. Now, of course, the Taranis is also going to alert me automatically for low voltage. But there's always a problem. If you're using voltage for battery warning, is at what point do you set the voltage? We all know, as you apply throttle, that your voltage is going to sag, because the current draw is going to increase and the voltage is going to decrease. So if you set your battery voltage at, say, 3.2 volts, you're actually, if that 3.2 volts is going to happen with low throttle setting, if you apply throttle, it's going to sag well below that, so you'll be too late. If you set it at, say, 3.7 volts, then you may not get an alarm in time if you're cruising around at a low throttle setting. So that's always a problem. The same with the LiPo alarms. I've tried to solve this with the Taranis programming by making the voltage warning dependent on the throttle setting. So if you apply full throttle, it's going to give an alarm at a higher voltage than when your throttle is all the way down. That way you have a reasonably good estimate of when you need to land. Let me show you how I did that. First of all, I configured a custom switch, or two custom switches, that are going to trigger depending on your throttle setting. So I divided the throttle in three. The lower 33% is going to be my first setting. Then as I increase the throttle beyond 33%, you're going to see that switch H activates. And if I move beyond 66%, switch I will also activate. Those are my three thresholds. That is configured in the custom switch menu. I have them all the way down because I use these settings on all planes and I don't want to confuse it with the rest. So here I compare the throttle value with -33 and +33, and they will activate as you increase the throttle. You can see that it becomes bold. And then I have three lines that are going to compare the cell value, so the lowest LiPo cell voltage, with any of these three numbers, and these switches will trigger in combination with whether or not these custom switches are active. So the 3.74 volt is only triggered when custom switch A is not on, and custom switch A triggers the moment the throttle goes beyond 33%. So this value will be used with low throttle. As you increase the throttle between -33 and +33, this value is going to be used as a reference, and finally in the upper third it's going to trigger an alarm or trigger the switch when you fall under 3.48 volts. Now that may depend very much on your plane how you want these values to be set, but it gives you a starting point. Then I have two lines here to combine the previous one. If any of these two is true, then this is true, and if any of this or this is true, then finally custom switch N becomes true. So this, if custom switch N becomes true, I need to land or my battery is low. And you can see that here in the custom functions. When custom switch N is triggered, for every 10 seconds there's a little siren that plays, and every 20 seconds there's a battery low warning. You can configure that whatever way you want, but I found this a decent compromise. So that's a quick overview of how I configured it. I'm sure everyone will have their own preferences and they will want to use other switches, but if you want a template, if you want to see how did I do this, you can just download it. I'll provide the download link in the description of this video, and I hope you found this useful.